Power and Terror by Noam Chomsky. The book is all about conflict, hegemony, and the rule of force. Well, it's edited by these people, and that's the press. These are the contents. The foreword by Chris Hedges, that's what I'm going to read. So I'm reading from the foreword. Noam Chomsky is America's greatest intellectual. His massive body of work, which includes nearly 100 books, has for decades deflated and exposed the lies of the power elite, the myths they perpetuate, and the complicity of a duplicitous liberal class. Chomsky has done this despite being blacklisted by the commercial media, ignored by academics that he towers above, and turned into a pariah. His influence as a thinker comes from his marriage of moral autonomy with rigorous and exacting scholarship. He has a stunning grasp of detail, a deep understanding of the nature of power and language, as well as a remarkable talent to synthesize information into withering and present social and political critiques. He correctly dismisses our two party system as a mirage orchestrated by the corporate state. He excoriates the liberal class for being weak and complicit in the corporate demolition of the country. He describes the drivel of the commercial media as a form of brainwashing and as our nation's most recent critique of unregulated capitalism, globalization, and the poison of empire. He warns us that we have little time left to save our anemic democracy. The book Power and Terror is Chomsky at his best. He demonstrates his ability in these interviews and lectures to stand in the shoes of those outside our gates and ask the uncomfortable moral questions that should be asked. He excoriates US intellectuals for blindly supporting the bombing in Afghanistan and correctly asks how many of these same intellectuals would have supported bombing Washington because of the US wars against Nicaragua or Cuba. This is vintage Chomsky. Chomsky believes passionately in justice and the rule of law. The standards we apply to others should, he argues, also be applied to us. And this simple demand that the rule of law be followed is in the world of foreign policy and especially our relations with Israel, a radical and unheard of stance. It challenges the assumed moral superiority that has infected the power elite and our intellectual class and mandarins and courtiers, many of whom drift from the university to government and back again. Chomsky has none of it. He exposes a crime as a crime. Unpopular ideas can be supported without the use of force, Chomsky warns, and a good education is an effective means to reach this result. Well, unless we can become capable of thinking the thoughts that are banned by imperial ideology, understanding of what's happening in the world is going to be very difficult to attain. Chomsky has likened our decayed state to that of Weimar Germany. He points to the widespread apathy and disillusionment with with electoral politics and the failure of traditional liberals to advance basic liberal values, serving instead the crushing demands of the corporate state. He warns that the growing distaste for the traditional parties here, as in Weimar Germany, opens up a space that radical groups and the lunatic fringe of the political landscape are beginning to fill. The United States is extremely lucky that no honest, charismatic figure has risen. Chomsky told me every charismatic figure is such an obvious crook that he destroys himself live, like McCarthy or Nixon or the evangelist preachers. If somebody comes along who is charismatic and honest, this country is in real trouble because of the frustration, disillusionment, the justified anger, and the absence of any coherent response. What are people supposed to think if someone says, I have got an answer, we have an enemy? There it was the Jews, here it will be the illegal immigrants and the blacks. We will be told that white males are a persecuted minority. We will be told we have to defend ourselves and the honor of the nation. Military force will be exalted. People will be beaten up. This could become an overwhelming force. And if it happens, it will be more dangerous than Germany. The United States is the world power. Germany was powerful, but had more powerful antagonists. I don't think all this is very far away. If the polls are accurate, it is not the Republicans, but the right wing Republicans, the crazed Republicans who will sweep the next election. I have never seen anything like this in my lifetime. Chomsky said, I'm old enough to remember the 1930s. My whole family was unemployed. There were far more desperate conditions than today, but it was hopeful. People had hope. The CIO was organizing. No one wants to say it anymore. The Communist Party was the spearhead for labor and civil rights organizing. Even things like giving my unemployed seamstress aunt a week in the country. It was alive. There is nothing like that now. The mood of the country is frightening. The level of anger, frustration, and hatred of institution is not organized in a constructive way. It is going off into self-destructive fantasies. I listen to talk radios, Chomsky said. I don't want to hear Rush Limbaugh. I want to hear the people calling it. They are like Joe Stack. What is happening to me? I've done all the right things. I'm a God fearing Christian. I work hard for my family. I have a gun. I believe in the values of the country. And my life is collapsing. Chomsky has more than any other American intellectual followed the downward spiral of the American political and economic systems in works such as On Power and Ideology and Manufacturing Consent. He reminds that the genuine intellectual inquiry is always subversive. It challenges cultural and political assumptions. It critiques structures. It is relentlessly self critical. It implodes the self indulgent myths and stereotypes we use to elevate ourselves and ignore our complicity in the acts of violence and oppression. And it always makes the powerful as well as their liberal apologists deeply uncomfortable. Chomsky reserves his fiercest venom for the liberal class who serve as a smokescreen for the cruelty of unchecked capitalism and imperial war. He has consistently exposed their moral and intellectual posturing as a fraud. And this is why Chomsky is hated and perhaps feared more among liberals than among the right wing. He also excoriates. When Christopher Hitchens decided to become a wind up doll for the Bush administration after 9/11, one of the first things he did was write a vicious article attacking Chomsky. Hitchens, unlike most of the warmongers he served, knew which intellectual in America mattered. I don't bother writing about Fox News, Chomsky said when he spoke. It's too easy. What I talk about are the liberal intellectuals, the ones who portray themselves and perceive themselves as challenging power, as courageous and standing up for truth and justice. They are basically the guardians of the faith. They set the limits. They tell us how far we can go. They say, look how courageous I am, but do not go 1 millimeter beyond that. At least for the educated sectors, they are the most dangerous in supporting power. Chomsky, because he steps outside of every group and eschews all ideologies, has been crucial to American discourse for decades, from his work on the Vietnam War to his criticism of the Obama administration. He stubbornly maintains his position as an iconoclast who one who distrusts power in any form. And he's one of the few voices that speak to the reality of war, the disastrous effects of imperial power, and the fact that rather than promoting virtue or waging war based on good intentions, the permanent war economy is consuming and destroying hundreds of thousands of innocent lives. Chomsky understands that to speak morally, one must always be alienated from the systems of power, no matter what the ideological stripe. He sees two sets of principles that are at odds with each other. The first is power and privilege, the second is truth and justice. Those like Chomsky, who vigorously pursue truth and justice, are despised by those who seek privilege and power, and the traditional liberal class, posing itself as the conscience of the nation while also seeking access to privilege and power, detests Chomsky because he exposes to public view their hypocrisy and duplicity. The liberals, the ones who call themselves the reluctant folks and support war as the only valid moral choice, illustrate the deceitful game war and the liberal class play. These liberals, communist columnists such as Thomas Friedman or Michael Egantieff, currently the Canadian Liberal Party leader, seek at once to appease the power brokers they serve and yet claim for themselves the virtues they have betrayed. Chomsky will have none of it. Some of Chomsky's book will consist of things like analyzing the misrepresentations of the areas plan in Central America, and he will devote 200 pages of it to Middle East scholar Norman Finkelstein and said, when we spoke about Chomsky, and 2 years later, who will have heard of Oscar Arias? It causes you to wonder, would Chomsky have been wiser to write things on a grander scale, things with a more enduring quality, so that you read them 40 or 60 years later? This is what Russell did in books like Marriage and Morals. Can you even read any longer what Chomsky wrote on Vietnam and Central America? The answer has too often been no. This tells you something about him. He's not writing for ego. If he were writing for ego, he would have written a grand style that would have buttressed his legacy. He's writing because he wants to effect political change. He cares about the lives of people, and there the details count. He's trying to refute the daily lies spewed out by the establishment media. He could have devoted his time to writing philosophical treatises that would have endured like Kant or Russell, but he invested in the tiny details which make a difference to win a political battle. I try to encourage people to think for themselves, to question standard assumptions. Chomsky said when I asked about his goals, don't take assumptions for granted. Begin by taking a skeptical attitude towards anything that is conventional wisdom. Make it justify itself. It usually can't. Be willing to ask questions about what is taken for granted. Try to think things through for yourself. There is plenty of information. You've got to learn how to judge, evaluate, and compare it with other things. You have to take some things on trust or you can't survive. But if there is something significant and important, don't take it on trust. As soon as you read anything that is anonymous, you should immediately distrust it. If you read in the newspapers that Iran is defying the international community, ask who is the international community? India is opposed to sanctions, China is opposed to sanctions, Brazil is opposed to sanctions. The non aligned movement is vigorously opposed to sanctions and has been for years. Who is the international community? Is it Washington and anyone who happens to agree with it? You can figure that out, but you have to do work. It is the same on issue after issue. Chomsky's courage to speak on behalf who of those whose suffering is minimized or ignored in mass culture, especially the Palestinians, holds up the possibility of the moral life, and perhaps even more than his scholarship, his example of intellectual and moral independence sustain all those who defy the cant of systems of power to speak the truth. I can't tell you how many people, myself included, and this is not hyperbole, whose lives are changed with him, said Finkelstein, who, like Chomsky, has been ridiculed and ignored because of his intellectual courage and independence. Were it not for Chomsky, I would have long ago succumbed. I was beaten and battered in my personal life. It was only the knowledge that one of the greatest minds in human history has faith in me that compensates for this constant, relentless, and vicious battering. There are many people who are considered uh, non entities, the so called little people of this world, who suddenly get an email from Noam Chomsky. It breathes new life into you. Chomsky has stirred many people to realize a level of their potential that would forever have been lost. That's the ISBN number 978 1 59451 971 0. That's the Paradigm Publishers, and written something about Chomsky, professor of linguistics at the MIT Massachusetts Institute of Technology, uh, is the author recently of Hopes and Prospects 2010, and Perilous Power Paradigm 2007. His articles and books revolutionized the contemporary study of linguistics. Actually, I just knew him as a great linguist, and since I'm not such a political person, I find you should go through his books, which he has written on linguistics. Absolutely wonderful. But he does write well. He makes you think and get a balanced view of the world at large. A must read book. Happy reading.